I used to think the most frightening thing a father could ever hear was that something had happened to his children. I was wrong. Something far worse is not knowing what is happening, not knowing where your children are, and not knowing why they remain silent when you have called them again and again. 3 days later, when I looked back at my phone and saw 14 unanswered calls, I still had no idea that what would hurt me the most was not what I had imagined had happened to my sons, but the completely different truth waiting for me in Miami. My name is Gary Cooper. I was 52 years old, and I lived with my wife, Kate, in Shaker Heights, Ohio. I ran Anvil Biomed, a company that specialized in maintaining critical medical equipment for hospitals. I had spent most of my life building that company, but if there was one thing I had always placed above my work, it was my family. I lost my father when I was 7 years old. I do not remember everything that happened back then, but I remember very clearly what it felt like when someone you believed would always be there suddenly disappeared. Maybe that memory was what made me become the kind of father who always wanted to be there whenever his children needed him. I once promised myself that if I ever had children, they would never have to wonder whether their father would show up. Harry and Darren were the 2 boys who made me keep that promise for more than 20 years. I never thought I was a perfect father, but I always tried to give my sons better opportunities than I had been given. When Harry and Darren grew up, I helped them whenever I could. I paid their tuition, supported them when they started building lives of their own, and even co-signed the lease for Harry's luxury apartment in Miami. To me, none of that was a debt they had to repay. I simply believed that if I had the ability to help my children, then helping them was the natural thing to do. I never imagined that one day, the very help I had given them would become the reason they wanted to get away from me. Everything began on an ordinary morning. I received an email from the management company of Harry's apartment asking me to confirm some information so his lease could be renewed with me remaining as the guarantor. They needed a few details about his income, so I simply called Harry to ask him. I called once, no answer. I did not think much of it. Harry had a job, his own life, and I knew he did not always keep his phone nearby. About an hour later, I called again. This time, the call went straight to voicemail. I left a message telling him that Dad had received an email about the apartment and needed a few details to complete the paperwork. I told him to call me whenever he had a chance. Then I put my phone down and went back to work. By evening, Harry still had not called. I sent another message and called again. Still nothing. At that point, I was starting to feel slightly irritated, but I was not worried yet. I told myself he was probably just busy. I did not want to become the kind of father who called constantly just because his son did not answer immediately. But then I called Darren. I only wanted to ask whether he had spoken to his brother. Darren did not answer either. I called again later, nothing. I sent him a message. "Have you talked to Harry today?" The message went through, but there was no reply. That night, Kate watched me check my phone for what felt like the 100th time before asking, "Are you worried?" I told her no, that the boys were probably just busy. But even as I said it, I realized there was something preventing me from feeling at ease. One son not answering could be normal. Both sons being unreachable at the same time was harder to explain. The next morning, I called again. Harry did not answer. Neither did Darren. I began looking at my call history. I was not someone who normally called my sons constantly. I understood that they were grown men with lives of their own. I did not need them to call me every day, and I did not need to know everything they were doing. But I had always believed that if something truly serious happened, they would call me. That was what I believed, and that belief was beginning to scare me. The second day passed without a single message from either of them. I started thinking about accidents. I thought about hospitals. I imagined police officers standing at my front door, telling me they were sorry. I knew those thoughts might have been irrational, but I had lost my father when I was very young. I knew how quickly someone could disappear from your life, and I did not want to experience that feeling again with Harry or Darren. I tried to focus on work, but I couldn't. My phone was always within reach. Every time the screen lit up, I immediately looked down, not Harry, not Darren. By the evening of the third day, I had called 14 times, 14 calls, not one returned. I was sitting in the living room with my phone in my hand, while Kate sat across from me. I stared at the screen for a few more seconds before finally saying, "We're going to Miami." Kate did not ask if I was sure. She only asked when, tomorrow morning. I could not keep sitting in Ohio and imagining the worst. If something had happened to Harry, I needed to be there. If something had happened to Darren, I needed to know. And if they were simply angry with me, then I needed to hear that from them directly. I did not know that the last thought would become the one that hurt the most. Because the next morning, when Kate and I boarded the plane to Miami, I still believed I was flying thousands of miles to find two sons who might be in danger. I did not know that Harry was completely fine. Darren was too. There had been no accident, no hospital, no police, no tragedy at all. My two sons were living their normal lives. And what I did not know was that they had seen my calls. They knew I was looking for them. They knew I was worried. But they had still chosen not to answer. I only learned the truth when I stood outside Harry's 14th floor apartment in Miami. I remember walking down the hallway with Kate, still thinking through every possible explanation. I had prepared myself for a serious conversation, but I had not prepared myself for what I was about to see, because as soon as we got close to the apartment, I heard music coming from inside, then laughter. I stopped in front of the door and looked at Kate. For the first few seconds, I could not even understand what it meant. If Harry was in trouble, why was there laughter inside? If he had disappeared, why was the apartment full of people? I raised my hand and knocked. I still did not know that within seconds, all the fear I had carried for 3 days would turn into something completely different. A feeling I never thought I would have toward my own son, betrayal. I knocked on Harry's apartment door with a feeling I could hardly describe. After 3 days of being unable to reach him, I had prepared myself for many possibilities, but part of me still held on to the hope that when the door opened, everything would suddenly make sense. Maybe Harry had simply been busy. Maybe his phone had stopped working. Maybe something had happened between the two brothers that I did not know about. Whatever the reason, I still believed that once I saw my son with my own eyes, I would know that he was okay. But the moment the door opened, I realized that the thing I had been afraid of had never happened. Harry was standing in front of me, holding a glass of wine. He was not dressed like someone who had been through an accident or a crisis, and behind him was a brightly lit apartment, filled with music, laughter, and the voices of several people. For the first few seconds, I simply stood there looking at my son, trying to connect the image in front of me with the 3 days I had just lived through. I had imagined hospitals, accidents, police officers, and terrible news that could change my life, while my son was standing in front of me perfectly healthy, holding a glass of wine and looking at me as though my arrival was the problem that needed to be dealt with. Harry looked at me, then at Kate. There was no relief in his expression, no surprise of the kind I thought I would see. He simply frowned and asked, "What are you doing here?" For a moment, I did not know how to answer. I wanted to ask why he had not answered his phone, why he had ignored my messages, and why he had not called back. But suddenly all of those questions became difficult to say when I was standing in front of someone who was obviously completely fine. I simply told him that I had called several times and could not reach him, so his mother and I had become worried that something had happened. Harry sighed as though I had just said something deeply inconvenient. He told me that he was fine, then asked why we could not understand that he had been busy and wanted to be left alone. The way he said it took me a few seconds to process what I had just heard. I looked at him, then at Kate, because all I could think about was myself the night before, sitting beside my phone and imagining police officers standing at my front door. I told Harry that I did not know how much space he wanted, But if he simply needed some privacy, he could have said so. I did not need him to call me every day. I did not need to know what he was doing. I only needed to know that he was safe. Harry did not soften. He said that was exactly the problem. According to him, I always wanted to know where they were, what they were doing, and whether they were okay. He said I called too much, asked too many questions, and always showed up whenever they had a problem, as though they were incapable of handling their own lives. I listened to him and almost did not recognize the person standing in front of me, because I had never imagined that the things I did could be seen that way. I asked Harry when caring about your own son had become something he hated. He looked at me and said that I did not understand. He said he was an adult, that he did not need his parents controlling his life anymore, and that I needed to learn how to take care of my own life instead of constantly interfering with his. I did not know what to say. I did not want to argue with my son in front of his own home. I did not want this trip to become a fight about everything I had done for him. I only wanted to understand why a simple question about whether he was safe had made him so angry. Then I noticed a woman standing behind Harry. She stepped closer and smiled, placing a hand on Harry's arm. I had never met her before, but I did not need much time to understand who she was. Harry introduced her as Haley, his fiancée. I looked down at her hand and saw the ring, an engagement ring. I looked at Kate. I saw her expression change immediately. For years, Kate had kept an antique ring that had belonged to her mother. She had once told me that when one of our sons got married, she wanted to give it to the woman who would become her daughter-in-law. It was not especially valuable in terms of money, but it carried memories from several generations of our family. Kate had kept it for 20 years. She used to tell me that she did not know who would eventually wear it, but she wanted to wait until her first daughter-in-law came into the family. I looked at her then and knew exactly what she was thinking about. Maybe she was also thinking that, after 3 days of fearing something had happened to Harry, at least we had arrived to discover that our son was healthy, engaged, and hosting a party. But the joy never had a chance to appear. Haley looked at us and said she was happy to finally meet Harry's parents. But then she glanced toward the people inside the apartment and mentioned that this was a private party. She never directly told us to leave, but the meaning was unmistakable. We were not invited. We had walked into an engagement party at exactly the wrong moment. Kate tried to remain calm. She congratulated Harry and Haley, then said that we had not known about the engagement. Harry simply replied that it was because he had not wanted to tell us yet. I asked why. Harry said he did not want us to make everything complicated. I looked at my son and felt something inside me begin to change. It was no longer the fear I had carried on the plane. It was not quite anger either. It was more like the feeling of someone discovering that they had been standing outside a door for years, only to realize that the person inside had never wanted to open it. I asked Harry that if something this important was happening in his life, why he had not told us. He said it was because we would make it about ourselves. I did not understand. I asked him whether a simple congratulations from his parents was really something that made him uncomfortable. Harry did not answer immediately. He simply said, the problem was not the congratulations. The problem was the way I always wanted to be part of every decision he made. I was about to tell him that I had never asked him for permission to make his own choices. But before I could speak, a voice came from inside. Darren. He stepped out from the living room, holding a glass of wine. When he saw Kate and me, he did not look surprised at all. That immediately caught my attention. Darren looked at us as though he had already known we were coming. I asked him if he knew Harry had not answered my calls for the past 3 days. Darren gave a faint, mocking smile. He said of course he knew. I stared at him. You knew, Darren, said Harry had told him. I asked why neither of them had called me back. Darren shrugged and said something I would remember for a very long time. Because we didn't want to. I said nothing. I simply looked at my 2 sons. In my mind, I saw the 14 calls. I remembered the nights I had woken up to check my phone. I remembered the way my heart jumped every time the screen lit up. I remembered imagining the worst things that could have happened. I remembered the flight to Miami and the way I had tried to convince myself that everything would be okay once I saw them. And now I was standing in front of them, hearing them admit that they knew I was calling and had deliberately chosen not to answer. I asked Darren why. He said they wanted me to understand that they were adults. I told him that if they wanted me to step back, they only had to say so. Darren said that was exactly what they had been trying to tell me for years, but I refused to listen. I looked at Harry. He did not deny it. I asked them when they had ever tried to tell me that. Darren began talking about the times I had called to ask where they were, the times I had offered to help, the times I had asked about their work, and the times I had shown up when they had problems. Things that, in my memory, were moments when I had tried to be a responsible father, had become, in Darren's version of the story, evidence that I did not know how to let them live on their own. I did not argue over every detail. I did not want to turn that night into an inventory of everything I had done for them. I only asked one question. Do you really think Dad did all of that because he didn't trust you? Harry answered that yes, he did. I looked at him and saw no explosive anger in his eyes. Somehow, that hurt even more. He was saying those things with the calmness of someone who had thought about them for a very long time. He said both brothers had chosen to attend schools thousands of miles away, partly because they wanted to get away from my interference. I did not know how to respond. Some words, when spoken during an argument, can be dismissed as things people say when they are angry. But Darren was not shouting. Harry was not shouting either. They were speaking as if they were explaining a truth that I was the last person to discover. I asked them whether they had really ignored my calls for 3 days on purpose, just to make me worry. Darren said it was not about making me worry. He said they wanted me to learn a lesson. I looked at him. What lesson? Darren said I needed to understand that they did not need me standing behind them all the time. I could not stop thinking about the past 3 days. I had barely slept. I had imagined accidents. I had imagined hospitals. I had flown from Ohio to Miami because I was afraid I might lose one of my sons. Meanwhile, to them, all of that had simply been a way to teach me that they did not need me. I did not tell them they had to be grateful. I did not tell them I had done everything for them. I simply looked at Harry and Darren and asked, "Do you know Dad thought you might be dead?" For the first time, both of them fell silent. But that silence was not like the silence of the previous 3 days. This time, I knew exactly what it meant. Harry finally said he had not thought things were that serious. I nodded. I did not want to say anything else, because by then I had begun to understand that the most painful part was not that they wanted their own lives. I could accept that completely. Children grow up. They are supposed to leave their parents. I had always wanted them to stand on their own feet. What I could not accept was that they knew I was afraid and still chose to let me remain afraid. I looked around the apartment. Harry's friends were still there. A few people avoided looking at us. Music was still playing. Drinks were still sitting on the tables, and the engagement cake remained in the middle of the room. Life inside that apartment seemed to be continuing normally. Kate and I were the only two people who no longer seemed to know where we belonged. Haley walked over and said she did not want the evening to become tense. I looked at her. I did not blame Haley, because she did not know what had happened during those 3 days. She was not the person I had called 14 times. She was not the person who had sat in Ohio, imagining her son lying in a hospital. But when she suggested that we should leave, so Harry could enjoy the evening with his friends, I realized that in that apartment, there truly was no place left for us. Kate quietly wished them happiness. I congratulated them too. Then we turned around and walked away. I thought I would be furious when I left that apartment. I thought I would tell Harry that he had no right to treat his parents that way. I thought I would remind him of everything I had done for him, but I did none of those things. Another kind of silence had appeared inside me, and this time it did not come from fear. It came from finally looking at everything I had done over the years and wondering whether I had been protecting people who no longer wanted to be protected by me. On the way back to the hotel, Kate said nothing. Neither did I. We sat beside each other in the car, both staring out the window. After several minutes, Kate asked quietly, "Did you know they thought of us this way?" I shook my head. No. She looked down at her hands. I knew she was thinking about the antique ring she had kept for 20 years. She had once imagined the day she would give it to her future daughter-in-law, perhaps over a family dinner, perhaps in a private moment between two women. But that night, she had stood outside her own son's engagement party and learned about his upcoming marriage at almost the same time as strangers in the room. She did not cry. That hurt me more. I was used to seeing Kate cry when she was hurt. But that night, she simply looked through the car window and remained silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, she said maybe we had done something wrong without realizing it. I did not answer immediately, because I was asking myself the same question. Had I loved my sons in a way that made them feel controlled? Had my attempts to help them made them feel as though they were always indebted to me? Or had I confused being a father with always having to be there to solve every problem they had? I did not know. But I knew one thing very clearly. I could not go back to that apartment and keep arguing. I could not force Harry to need me. I could not make Darren see my help as love. And I certainly could not force two Greek men to be grateful for things they had decided to view as interference. That night, I lay on the hotel bed and, for the first time, did not check my phone. I did not wait for Harry to call. I did not wait for Darren to text. I had spent 3 days afraid that I might lose them. By then, I was beginning to understand that there was another kind of loss that could be even harder to accept. You can lose someone because they are no longer alive. But you can also lose someone who is standing right in front of you, still alive, still healthy, still speaking to you, while somewhere inside themselves they have already decided that they no longer need you. And I began asking myself, if Harry and Darren truly wanted me to stop protecting them, then what exactly was I still protecting? That question followed me all the way back to Ohio. I did not know that the next morning I would call my lawyer, Paul Hopper. And for the first time in more than 20 years, I would not be calling to give my sons another opportunity. I would be calling to take back what I had given them. The flight from Miami back to Ohio was almost completely silent. Kate sat beside me with both hands resting on her small bag, staring out the window. I knew she was thinking about Harry Darren, and especially the antique ring that had belonged to her mother and that she had kept for 20 years. She had once imagined giving it to the woman who would become her daughter-in-law. But instead of a warm family moment, she had learned that her son was engaged at the very party where our presence had been treated like an inconvenience. After a long silence, Kate finally said, "I'm not sad because the ring wasn't given to her." She paused before continuing. "What hurts is realizing that our sons don't see us as part of their lives anymore." I did not know how to comfort her, because what she had just said was exactly what I was trying to accept myself. For years, I had believed I was protecting Harry and Darren. But on that flight home, for the first time, I wondered whether they actually saw love in the things I did, or whether they only saw a father constantly standing behind them, ready to interfere whenever something went wrong. I could not change the way they saw me, but I could change the way I continued to treat them. The next morning, I went into my office and called my lawyer, Paul Hopper. I told Paul everything that had happened in Miami, from the 14 unanswered calls to the confrontation at the apartment. I made it clear that Harry and Darren had admitted they deliberately ignored me because they wanted me to understand that they no longer needed their parents' help. Paul asked what I wanted to do. I said, "I want them to take responsibility for themselves, just like they said they wanted." The first issue was Harry's apartment. I was still listed as the guarantor on his lease, and the renewal deadline was approaching. I had signed that lease when Harry needed my support, But things were different now. If Harry wanted me to stop interfering in his life, I had no reason to continue standing behind a financial obligation he wanted to handle himself. Paul prepared the necessary documents, and I signed them. I did not ask Harry to leave the apartment. I did not call the management company to make things harder for him. I simply removed myself as guarantor before the renewal deadline. I knew that decision could make things difficult for Harry. But I also knew something simple. If I continued guaranteeing his lease, after he had just told me he did not need me, then I would be contradicting his own words. After that, Paul reviewed the other financial obligations. Darren had a business line of credit secured by one of my assets. I had agreed to that years earlier when Darren was expanding his work and needed additional capital. At the time, I thought it was simply another way to help my son build his future. But now, looking at the paperwork, I realized Darren had been an adult for a long time. He was no longer the boy who needed his father standing behind every step he took. I instructed Paul to begin the process of removing my asset from the guarantee according to the legal terms. That forced the bank to reassess Darren's credit line. If he wanted to keep the financing, he would have to prove his own financial ability or provide another form of collateral. Then there was Darren's Jeep. I had been involved in the financing of the vehicle and had told him more than once that if he ever ran into trouble, he could call me. But after what happened in Miami, I no longer wanted to play the role of the person standing behind every financial obligation Darren had. Paul sent written notice to the lender, confirming that I would not continue assuming responsibility for future overdue payments beyond any obligations I was legally required to fulfill. I signed each document. There was no music, no declaration of victory, no feeling of revenge. Just a father slowly removing his name from responsibilities that his own sons had told him they no longer needed him to carry. After signing the final document, I put the pen down and sat there for a while. I had once believed the day I had to do those things would be the saddest day of my life. But what made me sad was not the money. It was realizing how much time I had spent proving to my sons that I would always be there, while they had to see that presence as something they needed to escape. That evening, my phone rang Harry. I stared at the screen for several seconds before answering. His voice was no longer calm like it had been in Miami. He asked why the apartment management company had informed him that his lease renewal was now a problem. I told him I had withdrawn as guarantor. Harry immediately became angry. He said I knew he would be in trouble without my guarantee. I asked him if he remembered what he had said to me in Miami. He went silent. I said, "You told Dad to take care of his own life. That's exactly what I'm doing." Harry said I was punishing him. I shook my head, even though he could not see me. "No, Harry, I'm not punishing you. I simply can't keep protecting someone who has told me he doesn't need to be protected." I ended the call. Less than an hour later, Darren called. He was furious because the bank was demanding that he resolve the credit line situation. He asked how I could do that without warning him. I reminded him that I had spent years standing behind his loans. While in Miami, he had told me that both brothers wanted to live their own lives without my interference. Darren said I was trying to teach them a lesson. I replied, "No, I'm simply believing what you told me." He fell silent. I continued, telling him that if they truly could take care of their own lives, then I would respect that. I was not taking away anything they had built themselves. I was simply taking back the responsibilities that belonged to me. After the call, I put the phone down. Kate walked into the room and asked how things had gone. I told her they were both furious. She sat beside me and asked, "Do you regret it?" I thought for a moment before answering, "No. But I wish things hadn't come to this." Kate took my hand. I knew she wished the same. We did not want our sons to fail. We did not want them to lose their homes, their jobs, or face debts they could not handle. But we also could not keep saving them from every consequence, while they insisted they did not need us. I had once believed that being a father meant always keeping the door open whenever your children came home. Now I understood that sometimes being a father also means standing in front of that door and allowing your children to decide when they want to walk through it. I did not know how much Harry and Darren would have to pay for their decisions. I only knew that from that day forward, I would not chase after them anymore. If they wanted freedom, they would have it. If they wanted responsibility, I would respect that. And if one day they came back, I would decide how much I could help them. But this time, I would not spend the rest of my life proving that I was a good father by fixing every problem they created. I had done that long enough. And only 3 weeks later, I received a call I never expected. Harry and Darren were on their way back to Ohio, but they were not coming home to apologize. They were coming home because everything in Miami had begun to collapse. 3 weeks after my last conversation with Darren, a rented moving truck stopped in front of my house in Ohio late one afternoon. I was in the garage when I heard the engine outside. At first, I paid no attention until Kate came out of the living room and told me there were 2 men standing at the front door. I knew who they were before I even saw them, Harry and Darren. I walked outside and saw my 2 sons standing beside the rented truck. They looked completely different from the last time I had seen them in Miami. Harry no longer had the confidence of the man standing at his apartment door with a glass of wine in his hand. Darren no longer had the mocking attitude he had displayed at the party. Both looked exhausted, their clothes wrinkled, and their faces drawn after several weeks of dealing with problems I had once routinely helped them solve. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Finally, Harry spoke. "Are you happy now?" I looked at him and did not answer immediately. Harry said the apartment in Miami had sent a notice requiring him to resolve the lease situation after I withdrew my guarantee. He could not meet the new requirements within the required time and had to leave the apartment. He said the penalties, moving expenses, and other costs had made everything even worse. I listened to all of it. I did not tell him I had warned him. I did not tell him this was the consequence of his own choice. I simply asked, "What about your business?" Harry gave a bitter laugh. He said losing the apartment was only part of it. Once the credit line was restricted, his business flow began to collapse. Payments were delayed, contracts had to be put on hold, and people who had once worked with him started demanding their money on time. Within weeks, the business he had once believed he could control had become a mess. Darren was no better. The bank wanted additional collateral for his credit line. He did not have enough available to satisfy the requirement immediately. His Jeep loan also became a problem. Once he could no longer rely on me to deal with overdue payments. I looked at my 2 sons. I knew they were waiting for me to say something. Maybe they wanted an apology. Maybe they wanted me to open the door, pick up the phone, and call the bank. Maybe they believed that, if I agreed to step in one more time, everything could go back to the way it had been. But I did nothing. Harry began shouting. He said I had deliberately destroyed his life simply because he did not want to listen to me. He called me controlling and said I had used money to punish my own son. I let him finish. When Harry stopped, I asked, "Do you remember what you said in Miami?" He looked at me. I told him that he had told me to take care of my own life. He had said he did not need me to protect him. Darren had said the same thing. Both of them had said they wanted to take responsibility for their own lives and wanted me to stay out of them. I looked directly at Harry. "Dad simply believed you." Harry angrily said, "I knew withdrawing my guarantee would cause him to lose the apartment." I told him that yes, I knew it could create difficulties. But I had not taken his apartment away. I had simply stopped guaranteeing it. Darren stepped forward and said I was trying to teach them a lesson. I looked at him and said, "Maybe you're learning a lesson, but it's not one Dad wanted to teach you. It's a lesson life is teaching you itself." Darren fell silent. I told them that when they were children, it was our responsibility to protect them from things they were not yet capable of handling. But they were adults now. They had jobs, bank accounts, contracts, cars, and lives of their own. I could not be called controlling while continuing to carry responsibility for their decisions. Harry shouted that I was taking revenge. This time, I looked directly into his eyes and spoke slowly. This isn't revenge. This is growing up. If you don't need Dad to protect you, then you don't need Dad's name on your debts. Nobody said anything. I heard the wind moving through the trees behind the house. In that moment, I realized I no longer wanted to win the argument. I only wanted my sons to understand that I had not done those things to make them suffer. I had done them because, finally, I had listened to what they were saying. Kate stepped outside. Harry looked at his mother waiting. Maybe he thought Kate would be more forgiving than I was. Maybe he believed that if his mother stood on their side, things could still change. But Kate did not move toward Harry. She stood beside me. She looked at our two sons and said she was also heartbroken that things had reached this point. She did not want to see them lose their apartment or struggle with their businesses. But she had heard them with her own ears in Miami, saying that they wanted to live their lives without their parents interfering. "So your father and I are going to respect that," she said. Harry stared at his mother as though he could not believe what he had just heard. Darren asked whether Mom was taking Dad's side too. Kate said this was not about taking sides. This is about you being responsible for your own lives. Harry turned away. I looked at my two sons and suddenly remembered the little boys they had once been. I remembered them running into the house when they were hurt, calling me just to ask about something small, and the days when they needed me to be there for everything. I still loved them. That had never changed. But love could not turn grown men into children forever. Harry said he had nowhere to go. I looked at the house behind me. I knew I could tell them to stay. I knew I could open the door, bring them into the living room, and start calling the bank, the apartment management company, and everyone else involved to fix everything. I had done that dozens of times before, but this time, I did not. I told them they could stay for a few days if they needed time to find a place. But I would not handle their debts or solve their business problems for them. Harry looked at me. "Can you really do this to your own son?" I was silent for a moment before answering. "I'm not doing this to you. I'm letting you do this for yourself." He did not respond. Darren turned away. The two of them carried their belongings into the house in silence. That night, they slept in the living room. There was no family conversation, no apology, no embrace like the ones I had once imagined. But for the first time in years, my house became very quiet. I sat outside on the porch with Kate. Neither of us said much. I looked at the lights coming from the living room and knew our two sons were inside. They were still my children, but our relationship had changed. Kate rested her head on my shoulder. She said that maybe this was the hardest thing a parent ever had to do. Love your children without continuing to live their lives for them. I nodded. I looked across the yard and realized I was no longer angry. There was only a deep sadness. I never wanted Harry and Darren to fail. I never had. I only wanted them to understand that some of what they had once viewed as control had actually been love. But that love had gone too far when I turned protecting them into a responsibility with no end. That night, I made my final decision. I would not go back to the way things had been. I would not continue using money to keep my sons close to me. I would not allow the rest of my life to revolve around fixing problems that two grown men were capable of handling themselves. But I would not turn them into enemies either. If they needed time, I would give them time. If they wanted to rebuild our relationship, I would listen. But from that moment on, they would have to understand something it had taken me more than 50 years to truly learn. There are people you love so deeply that you are willing to do anything for them. But if you do everything for someone long enough, eventually they may forget that it was a sacrifice. They may begin to believe it was your obligation. And when they no longer need you, they may call that very love control. I did not want that to happen again. The next morning, when Harry and Darren left the living room, both were silent. No one mentioned Miami. No one mentioned money. But I knew the story was not over, because inside my office was something neither of them knew about. Everything I had spent my life building was still there. And after everything that had happened, I began asking myself a question I had never dared to ask before. If Harry and Darren no longer wanted me to protect them, why should I still leave them everything I had spent my life? My answer would completely change the future of this family. That morning, after Harry and Darren left the living room, I returned to my office and closed the door. I sat at the desk where I had signed the documents withdrawing my guarantee for Harry and ending my financial responsibilities toward Darren only weeks earlier. But this time, I was not looking at contracts or loan documents. I was looking at the trust documents I had created many years before. There was one thing in them I had always considered obvious. Most of my assets would be divided between Harry and Darren after I was gone. I had made that plan when they were still young. I imagined that one day they would take over what I had built, use it to create better lives for their own families, and eventually pass it on to another generation. I had never imagined I would one day sit in front of my estate plan and ask myself whether these were still the people I wanted to leave my entire legacy to. But after everything that had happened in Miami, I could no longer treat leaving my assets to my sons as an obligation. I called Paul. I told him I wanted to change the trust. Paul asked how I wanted to change it. I told him I no longer wanted Harry and Darren to remain the primary beneficiaries. I wanted most of the money to be transferred into scholarship funds for the children of fallen veterans. Paul was silent for a few seconds before asking if I was sure. I told him I had never been more certain of anything. I was not doing it to make Harry and Darren lose their inheritance. I did not want to use my will as a threat to force them to change the way they treated me. I had simply realized that if my wealth could create something good after I was gone, I wanted it to go to people who genuinely needed an opportunity. I thought about children growing up without their fathers. Children who were forced to mature earlier than others, not because they wanted to, but because life had demanded it of them. I had been one of those children. I knew what it felt like to grow up without a father. And I knew that a scholarship, an educational opportunity, or simply a helping hand at the right moment could change a child's entire life. I could not go back in time and change what happened to me when I was 7, but I could do something for another child. Paul began preparing the documents. When I signed them, I did not feel like I was taking anything away from Harry and Darren. For the first time, I was simply deciding that my legacy would not be used to prove how much I loved my children. I had spent more than 20 years proving that already. I had paid their tuition. I had guaranteed their homes. I had used my assets to support their businesses. I had stood behind loans that, at times, I did not even need to be involved in. I had flown thousands of miles, simply because I could not reach my sons for 3 days. I had never needed them to thank me for any of it, but I also did not want them to keep believing that a parent's love was an endless source of financial support. After all the paperwork was completed, I told Kate. She sat beside me for a long time without saying anything. Finally, she asked, "Are you sure you're not doing this because you're hurting?" The question made me think. I told her that perhaps the pain had given me enough courage to see a truth I had been avoiding, but the decision itself was not about hurting our sons. I did not want them to be poor. I did not want them to fail. I did not want them to live with regret. I simply did not want my wealth to become a price they had to pay in order to receive my love again. Kate nodded. She said that if this was truly what I wanted, she supported me. I looked at her and realized that throughout all those years, there was someone who had always been beside me, whom I had sometimes forgotten to appreciate properly. Kate had never demanded that I prove my love with money. She had never called me 14 times and told me I was not allowed to have a life of my own. She had never treated everything I did for our family as an obligation. She had simply been there. Through the years I built my company, raised our children, paid tuition bills, signed contracts, and worried about the future of our family. Kate had always been beside me. And I realized that I had spent so much time trying to keep Harry and Darren inside my arms, that I had sometimes forgotten to appreciate the person who had truly held my hand through the entire journey. That evening, Kate and I sat together on the porch. There was no music from a party, no phone constantly ringing, no bank paperwork on the table. Just the two of us and the quiet yard in front of our house. Kate asked if I was sad. I said yes. I did not want to lie to her. I was sad that things had come this far. I was sad that the children I once believed would always run toward me now looked at me like someone they needed to avoid. I was sad because some things cannot be repaired with a simple apology. But for the first time, that sadness did not make me want to chase after them. I no longer wanted to prove that I was a good father. I knew I had made mistakes. I had given too much. I had interfered too much. I had allowed my fear of losing my sons to become a reason to remain too close to their lives. Maybe I had made them feel suffocated. If so, that was a part of my mistake that I had to acknowledge. But I also understood something else. My mistake was not loving them. My mistake was allowing them to believe that my sacrifices were simply expected. I had taught them that I would always fix everything. And at some point, they had come to believe that it was my responsibility. I could not blame them entirely for that. A parent also has to take responsibility for the boundaries they never established. I had never established those boundaries until I was forced to. A few days later, Harry spoke with me. There was no grand apology. No emotional moment like the ones in movies, where everything is solved with a single embrace. He simply stood at the door of my office and said he still did not understand how I could do those things. I told him I did not expect him to understand immediately. I only wanted him to understand that I had not done those things to punish him. Harry was silent. I told him that if one day he wanted to rebuild our relationship, the door was still open, but I would not continue using money to pull him back into my life. If he wanted to call because he missed me, I would answer. If he wanted to tell me about his life, I would listen. But if he only called when he needed me to sign a document or pay a debt, things would be different. Harry did not say anything else. He turned and walked away. I did not know whether that conversation would change anything. Maybe it would take years. Maybe one day we would truly forgive each other. Or maybe our relationship would never return to what it had once been. I had accepted that. Because I finally understood that love does not always have a beautiful ending. Sometimes love simply means wishing someone well, even when you can no longer live their life for them. One afternoon several months later, I sat on the porch with Kate. Onville Biomed was still operating. Work continued. Life continued. Harry and Darren had also begun dealing with their own problems. We did not suddenly become a perfect family overnight. But at least everyone had begun to understand that each person had to take responsibility for their own part of life. Kate brought me a cup of coffee and sat beside me. I looked at her hand. Her mother's antique ring was still there. She had not given it to anyone. But this time, she no longer looked at it with sadness. She said maybe the ring could wait. I asked what it was waiting for. She smiled and said, "The right day." I took her hand. I used to think the greatest legacy a father could leave behind was what he gave his children. Money, homes, a company, assets that could be divided among them after he was gone. But now I thought differently. A true legacy is not found in a bank account. It is found in the way a person treats the people they love, in the values they pass down, and in the good things they leave behind. For people they may never even meet. I do not know what Harry and Darren will think about my decision someday. Maybe they will be angry. Maybe they will believe I took something away from them that should have belonged to them. But I hope that one day they will understand that I did not do it to take back what I had already given them. I did it so that, for the first time, they could have the chance to live their own lives without my shadow behind them, and I could have the chance to live the rest of mine without constantly fearing that if I stopped rescuing them, I would lose them. I looked at Kate. The woman who had been beside me through all those years was still sitting right there. I suddenly realized that, while trying to protect our children, from every hardship. I had sometimes forgotten to protect the marriage that had carried me through all of it. Kate did not need me to rescue her. She only needed me to be there. And perhaps that was what I needed to learn after everything that had happened. Not how to love my children less, but how to love them without losing myself. I leaned back in my chair and watched the afternoon lights slowly spread across the yard. Those 3 days of silence had once made me believe I was about to lose both of my sons. But in the end, that silence had forced me to hear something I had spent years refusing to hear. My sons were grown men, and I had to grow too in my own way, as their father. I could not keep them in my arms forever. I could not pay for every mistake. I could not guarantee every choice. And I certainly could not use my sacrifices to force them to love me in the way I wanted. All I could do was keep the door open when they needed a father, while also becoming strong enough to step back when they wanted to walk on their own. I looked at Kate, gently squeezed her hand, and smiled. For the first time in a very long time, I was not thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I still had, and I realized that sometimes peace does not come from keeping everyone you love close. It comes from knowing that you loved them enough to let them be free, and finally, knowing how to love your own life enough to keep moving forward.